Police ordered old black man to wait outside seconds later. He sat on the bench as judge. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. The marble steps of the United States Federal Court weren't built for chaos, but on this morning, they cracked under it. A white officer's voice cut through the crowd like a siren without mercy. Wait outside. This area isn't for you. He jabbed his finger at the man in the middle of the stairs, the man who did not flinch. 3 uniforms pressed in, their navy sleeves brushing against the black leather briefcase clutched calmly against an older chest. Behind them, phones rose into the air like witnesses being sworn in. A red recording light blinked, steady, unforgiving. The man at the center, gray hair, deep eyes, a crimson tie knotted with care, stood still, not stubborn, not fearful, just still, as if his very silence was louder than the commands hurled at him. His hands folded over the briefcase, veins traced like lines on a map, but his posture was unbroken. The officer's tone sharpened. I said check ID or step aside. Don't make me repeat myself. The crowd murmured. Someone whispered, why him? He looks like he belongs. Another muttered, record everything. But the man did not move. His gaze lingered on the massive columns behind the officers, the same columns that had held this courthouse for over a century. Pillars of stone, pillars of justice. And yet here he was, blocked at the threshold. The tension in the air wasn't just visible, it was physical, like the pause before a gavel strikes, like the inhale before a verdict is read. The officer stepped closer, his shadow falling across the older man's face. Sir, this entrance is reserved. You wait outside. The crowd winced at the word reserved. Phones inched higher, angles adjusted. History, injustice, and humiliation all framed for millions yet to see. Still, the man's silence held. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He didn't push back. He only adjusted the briefcase in his arms, as though cradling not documents but truth itself. And then his voice broke the moment, calm, resonant, sharp as a blade hidden in velvet. Before you tell me where I don't belong, check who I am first. The crowd stirred. The officers hesitated. The marble steps seemed to listen. And before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to the man standing on those courthouse steps. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't shout. He only stood, weathered yet unshaken, waiting, because the truth wasn't on its way. It was already here inside the briefcase he held, and in the authority no one around him had bothered to see. He looked ordinary enough to be ignored, and that was the point. No security detail, no assistant carrying files, no clerk walking 2 steps behind. Just one man in a tailored gray suit, a crimson tie, and a weathered leather briefcase. He had walked up those courthouse steps alone, under the same morning sun as everyone else, blending into the crowd until authority chose to single him out. The man's name was Harold Whitmore, 72 years old, son of a factory worker and a school teacher, grandfather of 4. And today, the presiding federal judge assigned to a case that would decide more than money, more than contracts. It would decide dignity, but none of the officers blocking his path cared to know that. They only saw what they wanted to see. An older black man standing too close to the entrance. A disruption in their order. A face that didn't match the picture in their heads of power. Harold had learned long ago how easily assumptions harden into walls. At 24, when he passed the bar, a clerk had told him, "You're in the wrong waiting room. This one's for attorneys." At 30, when he applied for his first judgeship, a colleague whispered, "Don't expect much. They don't put people like you in that seat." At 45, he sat silent while a bailiff explained court protocol to him, not realizing Harold was the one expected to deliver the verdict. So today, when the officer's hand brushed his arm, when the command, "Wait outside," echoed off the columns, Harold didn't flinch. It wasn't new. It was history replaying itself. The faces changed. The uniforms changed, but the undertone that he didn't belong remained the same. Only this time, they had chosen the wrong set of steps. From the crowd, a woman in a navy suit lowered her sunglasses, whispering into her phone, "This is escalating." A young man in a hoodie muttered, "Bet he's someone important." And 3 rows back, another bystander already had a live stream going. Viewers poured in. The comment counter ticked upward. But Harold wasn't performing for cameras. He never did. His stillness wasn't strategy. It was survival honed into second nature. His calm wasn't for show. It was the edge of a storm waiting for the right moment to break. The officers didn't see it. They leaned harder into their roles, shoulders squared, badges glinting under the morning light. One repeated, "Sir, this isn't your entrance. Move aside." Harold let the words hang in the air. He inhaled once, steady, the way he had done 1,000 times before delivering a sentence that would alter a life. His gaze shifted briefly to the great bronze plaque bolted above the doors. United States Federal Court. The irony pressed against him like another weight in the air. A court of law, a house of justice, a place where identity was supposed to be verified by truth, not by assumption. And here he was, denied at its very threshold. His fingers tapped lightly on the briefcase. Inside lay files, rulings, sealed documents, paperwork that would shape the day ahead, but those weren't the real power he carried. The real authority was carved in the oath he had taken decades ago, an oath none of these officers knew they were obstructing. Harold's lips pressed into a line. He still hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to, because the courtroom wasn't inside the building. It had already begun right there, on the courthouse steps. The air on the courthouse steps grew sharper, like a violin string pulled too tight. Every second of silence made the officers more restless, more certain that their authority was slipping with each phone camera rising above the crowd. The lead officer stepped closer, boots grinding against the stone. His voice was clipped, carrying across the plaza. "This entrance is for officials only. Move aside before we escort you." 2 others flanked Harold now, their hands hovering near their belts, rehearsed gestures of intimidation. They weren't pulling weapons, but they wanted him to notice the possibility. Harold noticed. He always noticed. He'd seen the same choreography in 100 hearings, from prosecutors circling witnesses to attorneys leaning too close to a jury box. The performance of control, the posture of power. He let it unfold without breaking his stance. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through it like wind in dry leaves. Someone whispered, "Why are they pressing him like that?" Another voice, "He hasn't done anything." A young woman in a blazer raised her phone higher. "They're about to regret this," she muttered under her breath. The officer on Harold's left narrowed his eyes. "Sir, I'm going to ask you again. Show ID or step down these stairs." The words carried a practiced patience, the kind laced with threat. Behind Harold, the columns loomed, casting long shadows across his shoulders. He looked like a man standing at the center of history's doorway, barred not by locks, but by prejudice dressed as protocol. Then the lead officer snapped, his finger stabbing the air just inches from Harold's chest. "This is your last warning." The crowd gasped at the tone. It wasn't procedure anymore, it was personal. Phones tilted. Someone said, "I'm live right now." Everyone's seeing this. Another added, "Don't stop recording." A teenager, barely tall enough to see over the shoulders in front of him, shouted, "Let him through." The tension climbed higher, step by step, frame by frame, as if the courthouse stairs themselves were carrying the weight of injustice. Still, Harold didn't move. He let the silence work for him. He let the cameras do what he would not. His jaw tightened once, barely perceptible, but enough for those closest to feel the shift. The officer took it as defiance. He leaned in, his breath hot with anger. "You think you're above the law. This isn't your house. You wait outside." For a moment, even the crowd seemed to stop breathing. The word house lingered in the air like smoke, bitter and heavy. Harold adjusted the grip on his briefcase. His voice had not risen, but when it came, it cut deeper than a shout. "Above the law? No, but I am the law inside this house." The crowd erupted, half with shock, half with applause. A man in a business suit shouted, "Check him first." Another voice echoed, "Listen to him." But the officers weren't ready to back down. Not yet. They tightened their formation, shoulders squared, boots planted firm. The lead officer barked again, this time louder, as though volume alone could drown out truth. "Identification now." And that was when Harold lifted his briefcase slightly, not opening it yet, just enough to draw every eye to it. He didn't need to raise his tone. He only said, calm and deliberate, "Everything you're asking for is in here. The question is, are you ready for what comes with it?" The plaza stilled, the cameras steadied, The courthouse steps felt like a stage set for a verdict no one had prepared to hear. The crowd expected fire. A protest. A raised voice to match the officer's bark. But Harold gave them none of it. He stood as if anchored to the marble beneath his shoes, every muscle calm, every breath measured. His silence wasn't empty, it was deliberate, filling the space louder than any argument could. The lead officer shifted, unsettled by the stillness. He had expected pushback, expected to press his authority against resistance. Instead, he found himself arguing with a wall of composure. Harold's eyes didn't flicker to the cameras. He didn't reach for his briefcase again. He simply stared past the officer's shoulder toward the bronze doors behind them, as if they were already open to him. A woman in the crowd whispered, "Why isn't he saying anything?" A man beside her shook his head. "Because he doesn't have to." The officer to Harold's right clenched his jaw. "Sir, silence won't help you here." But that was where he was wrong. Silence was helping. It was bending the atmosphere, pulling every gaze tighter on Harold, forcing the officers to hear their own voices echo against his restraint. He remembered another silence, decades earlier, 29 years old, sitting in a courtroom as opposing counsel mocked his credentials, telling the jury he was too green to be trusted. Harold had said nothing. Not then. He had waited. And when the verdict came, in his client's favor, silence had spoken louder than any protest could. Now, on these courthouse steps, history repeated. Silence was not weakness. It was patience, dressed as power. The officer in front of him grew louder, filling the space Harold refused to. "This is obstruction. You'll be removed." Phones rose higher. Gasps scattered through the crowd. The more the officer pushed, the more Harold's calm became unbearable, a mirror exposing the imbalance. From the back, a young bystander muttered into his live stream, "He hasn't said a word, and they look guilty already." The words drifted forward, carried by murmurs, until even the officers felt the shift. Their authority was no longer unquestioned. It was contested by silence itself. Harold inhaled once. The morning air was sharp with tension, tinged with the metallic tang of adrenaline, but his breath stayed steady. His briefcase pressed against his side, warm from his grip, heavy with more than paper. Heavy with the truth he carried. The officer snapped again, desperate. "You think standing quiet makes you untouchable?" Harold finally moved, not with words, not with force, but with a simple gesture. He straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin a fraction, and looked the officer directly in the eye. The silence cracked through the crowd like thunder. Applause didn't erupt yet, but the shift was undeniable. The onlookers felt it. The officers felt it. Power was tilting, inch by inch, toward the man who hadn't raised his voice. And then Harold spoke, just 4 words, measured and low. "I'm not done yet. Not a protest, not a play, a promise." The crowd leaned forward, hungry, waiting. The officers stepped back half an inch, though they didn't realize it. The courthouse doors loomed closer now, not just behind Harold, but as if they belonged to him already. And in that silence, carved sharp and heavy across the steps, everyone understood. The fight hadn't started yet. But when it did, the outcome was already written. It started with one red light. A phone raised from the back of the crowd, recording silently. Then another. And another. Within seconds, half a dozen small screens were aimed at the courthouse steps, their lenses catching every tremor in the officers' voices, every second of Harold's silence. A young woman in a navy suit spoke into her phone, her voice low but steady. "I'm standing outside the federal courthouse. They're blocking an elderly black man. He hasn't said a word, and they won't let him through." Her live stream counter ticked upward. 30 viewers, 50, then 200. Behind her, a teenager in a hoodie whispered, "This is gonna blow up." He turned his camera sideways, capturing the officer's bristling. Harold unmoved. His caption typed fast, numbered "Justice on the steps." The officers noticed. Their jaws tightened, their voices sharper, clipped like blades striking stone. The lead officer barked again, louder, as though to drown out the crowd. "Sir, comply now. Don't test our patience." But it was too late. Patience wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to the audience. A middle-aged man in a gray overcoat muttered to the stranger beside him, "You can feel it, can't you? He belongs there more than they do." His words were caught by a nearby phone mic, broadcast unfiltered to hundreds watching live. One officer shifted uneasily, eyes flicking toward the rising sea of cameras. He lowered his voice, hissing to his partner, "This is getting out of hand." But microphones caught that too. Nothing stayed private anymore. Harold remained still, letting the crowd grow around him. He could feel it, the shift. For decades, silence had been a shield he carried alone. Today, it was multiplying. Each witness became part of it, each recording another echo of truth. A young man in a wheelchair maneuvered closer, raising his phone high. His voice cracked but rang out. "Let him through. You're humiliating him." The words struck harder than any protest. They carried the raw edge of empathy, impossible to ignore. The crowd murmured, louder now, a chorus gathering around Harold without him lifting a hand. The officers pressed in tighter, but their authority was slipping fast, eroded by pixels and witnesses. Every order they gave sounded more like desperation, every glare more like guilt. From the far side of the plaza, a woman shouted, "Check his credentials before you embarrass yourselves further." Her voice was caught on 3 separate recordings, shared in real time across social media. Comments poured in. "This is unbelievable. He's clearly someone important. Why are they blocking him?" The courthouse steps had become more than stone. They were now a stage, and the crowd, once scattered, was no longer passive. They were actors in this unfolding drama, amplifying every moment. Harold's eyes drifted across them, not pleading, not asking, simply acknowledging. His silence was no longer his alone, it was shared. It resonated through the lenses, the whispers, the live streams. The lead officer barked once more, but this time, the sound was met not with compliance, but with a chorus of clicks, taps, and voices rising together. "We're watching. We're recording. Don't touch him." The plaza vibrated with it. Justice wasn't inside the courtroom yet. It was outside, breathing through the crowd, pulsing through their phones, waiting for the next move. The senior officer's patience snapped like glass underfoot. He closed the distance in a single stride, his gloved hand shooting forward. The crowd gasped as fingers clamped against Harold's arm, pushing him back a step toward the edge of the stair. "I said move!" the officer barked, loud enough for the plaza to vibrate with it. Gasps broke into shouts. Phones zoomed in, capturing the grip, the shove, the humiliation. Someone cried out, "Don't touch him!" Another voice shouted, "That's assault!" But the officer pressed harder, his hand digging into Harold's sleeve as if restraint could erase dignity. "People like you don't belong in federal court. You're a fraud, an imposter. Step down before I drag you." The words cut sharper than the shove. Fraud, imposter. They rang against the marble, echoed in the microphones of a dozen live streams, etched into memory like a scar. Harold staggered half a step, but his balance held. His briefcase never slipped. His gaze never wavered. He stood steady, the weight of 72 years anchoring him against the force of prejudice in uniform. The crowd erupted. A young woman screamed, "He's an elder. Respect him." A man in a business suit shouted, "You've crossed the line." Even those who had stayed silent before now lifted their voices, the injustice too visible to ignore. The officer sneered, emboldened by his own anger. "Don't think your silence makes you strong. It makes you weak, and weak men don't walk through these doors." Harold finally turned his head, slowly, eyes locking on the hand gripping his arm. He didn't yank free. He didn't struggle. He simply stared, unblinking, until the officer's grip began to tremble under the weight of that calm. The cameras caught everything, the arrogance, the shove, the insult, and now, the slow crumble of false authority under silence. From the far edge of the plaza, a woman's voice rang out, "Check who he is before you lose your careers." Her words sparked a wave. The crowd roared louder, phones rising higher, chants building in rhythm. "Let him through! Let him through!" The officer, red-faced, shoved once more. Harold's foot slid back against the marble edge. The sound of shoe against stone echoed like a verdict about to fall. Still, Harold did not raise his voice. He let the crowd do it for him. Their outrage had become his shield, their recordings, his testimony. Inside, the courthouse doors loomed closer now, despite the shove, despite the insult. Because Harold knew the truth, they couldn't keep him out. Not for long. He straightened, shoulders square, eyes sharp. And in that silent defiance, every witness felt it the moment when humiliation turned into inevitability. The officer didn't realize it yet, but the story had already shifted. His shove wasn't victory. It was evidence. And Harold? He was no longer just a man on the steps. He was the storm about to break. The officer's grip lingered on Harold's arm, but something had shifted. Not in Harold's body, he was still steady, unbroken. The shift was in the air, in the eyes of the crowd, in the silence that no longer felt like surrender but like a prelude. Harold's hand moved at last. Slow, deliberate. He adjusted the leather briefcase he had carried up those steps, as if it weighed nothing. Then, with the calm of a man who had lived 1,000 confrontations, he unlatched the brass clasp. Click. The sound was soft, almost swallowed by the shouts of the crowd, but it landed heavy in the officer's chest. Phones zoomed closer, arms craning upward. What was in the case? Documents. A protest letter? Harold didn't rush. He drew out a slim folder, then paused. His gaze swept across the officers blocking his path. His voice came low, steady, and sharp. You demanded identification. He opened the folder and lifted a single card, thick, gold-bordered, embossed with the seal of the United States Judiciary. The emblem glinted under the sunlight, unmistakable. The crowd gasped in unison. A ripple of realization surged through them. Someone shouted, "Oh my God, it's a judge's ID!" Another voice echoed, "He's the one in charge!" The officer holding Harold's arm froze, his fingers loosening without meaning to. His eyes darted to the card, then to Harold's face, then back again as if trying to rewrite reality. But Harold wasn't done. His free hand retrieved a phone from his jacket pocket. He tapped the screen once. The call rang only once before it was answered. "Judge Whitmore?" a crisp voice said on speaker. "We've been monitoring the feed. Do you want me to activate the internal protocol?" The plaza hushed. The crowd leaned closer, phones shaking in their hands. Harold's eyes never left the senior officer as he replied, calm as stone, "Yes. Begin documentation. Timestamp every word, every action." The voice answered immediately, "Understood. Logging now. Live stream evidence secured." The crowd erupted, cheers, gasps, voices shouting, "It's over for them!" A young man near the front yelled into his phone, "He called in protocol. They're recording everything officially now." The senior officer stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of cameras and truth. This doesn't prove anything." But his words faltered, drowned out by the rising tide of the crowd. Every syllable was already logged, every insult sealed in record. Harold lowered the card, returned it to the folder, and closed the briefcase with a quiet snap. Then, lifting his chin, he delivered words that cut through the chaos like a gavel strike. "You wanted proof. Now you're part of it." Phones shook as the crowd roared. Some clapped. Some shouted, "Justice!" Others simply stood stunned, realizing they had just witnessed the moment the tide turned. The officer's hand finally fell away from Harold's arm, not out of mercy, but out of fear. And Harold? He didn't gloat. He didn't shout. He simply adjusted his tie, tightened his grip on the briefcase, and took one quiet step forward toward the doors that were his by right. The fight was no longer about blocking him. It was about surviving the storm he had just unleashed. For a breathless moment, the steps of the courthouse stood in silence. Only the hum of live streams carried through the air, tens of thousands now watching from screens across the country. The senior officer tried to recover, his voice unsteady but still loud enough for the cameras. "That badge doesn't mean you belong here today. This entrance is still off limits." It was a desperate grasp at control, and everyone heard it. His words didn't land with authority, they landed with fear. Harold straightened, his crimson tie catching the light like a streak of fire. His briefcase hung at his side, but it wasn't the object that commanded the moment. It was him, the quiet resolve of a man who had been doubted 1,000 times and still walked taller every time. He spoke at last, his voice not raised, but deep, resonant, unshakable. "You've spent the last 10 minutes telling me I don't belong here. Let me clarify something for you." The crowd hushed, leaning forward. Harold lifted the ID again, but this time his other hand gestured to the massive bronze doors behind him. "This is my courtroom." Gasps cracked through the crowd like thunder. A woman shouted, "I knew it!" Another voice yelled, "He's the judge!" Phones shook as people zoomed in, desperate to capture every second. The senior officer blinked, stunned. "Your courtroom?" Harold's reply cut clean, like a gavel striking wood. "Yes, I am Judge Harold Whitmore, and in less than an hour, I will preside over the federal case scheduled in this building. The court you tried to keep me out of is the court I oversee." The crowd erupted. Applause broke out, sharp and raw. Some laughed in disbelief. Others cheered, voices colliding into chants of, "Judge Whitmore! Judge Whitmore!" The younger officers paled, their posture crumbling. One stammered, "Sir, we weren't aware." But Harold didn't let them retreat into excuses. His gaze swept across them, calm but heavy. You didn't ask, you assumed. And in your assumption, you chose insult over inquiry, force over respect, prejudice over law. Every word hit like a verdict, spoken not from anger, but from finality. The senior officer stepped back, his authority unraveling. His voice cracked in a half-whisper, "Judge Whitmore." The crowd was merciless now. Phones pointed directly at the officers, voices shouting, "Apologize. You just assaulted a federal judge." This is going viral. Harold did not raise a hand to silence them. He didn't need to. Their voices carried the justice he had always believed in, the justice that did not need shouting from him. Instead, he simply turned slightly, facing the courthouse doors. His words, however, were for the men who had tried to block him. 10 minutes ago, you told me to wait outside. Now you will wait outside, because the court does not open for men who mistake authority for justice." The crowd exploded, cheers, applause, chants blending into a wave of sound that shook the very steps. The officers stood frozen, their careers unraveling in real time, broadcast to the world. And Harold? He lifted his briefcase once more, calm and measured, and walked toward the doors. The marble under his shoes carried him forward, steady, inevitable. The gavel hadn't struck yet, but everyone watching knew. The judgment had already been delivered. The revelation detonated across the courthouse steps like a thunderclap. Judge. The word echoed, not just in the air, but on every phone screen, every live stream, every timeline flooding with clips. The officers stood stunned, faces drained of color, their rigid posture dissolving into fragments of panic. The senior officer's jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed him, darting left, right, anywhere but Harold's gaze. His command presence, once ironclad, was now paper-thin, shredded in front of hundreds. The younger officer who had grabbed Harold's arm slowly lowered his hand, as if it burned. His lips parted, fumbling for words that never came. We didn't know," he muttered, voice shaking. The crowd erupted at once. Cheers collided with outrage, laughter tangled with fury. "You touched a federal judge. Your career is over." "Justice, right here." A woman in the front row, phone raised high, shouted, "This is live to 20,000 people right now. 20,000! The officer flinched at her words, as if numbers alone carried the weight of his undoing. A man in a business suit clapped slowly, each strike of his hands deliberate, sharp. Others joined, applause swelling into a rhythm that drowned the officer's authority entirely. Every clap was a verdict, every cheer, a sentence. The senior officer's voice cracked as he attempted control. "Everyone calm down." But his words were swallowed by laughter. Someone jeered, "Calm down? You just tried to drag the judge off his own steps." Another voice followed, "You're finished." The officers exchanged frantic glances. Their radios crackled uselessly, drowned by chants that rose like waves. "Judge Whitmore, Judge Whitmore." The chant struck harder than sirens. It wasn't just noise, it was allegiance. The crowd had chosen its side, and it wasn't with the uniform. Phones shifted focus. The cameras no longer framed Harold as a suspect, they framed him as the calm center of a storm. Every lens caught the same image. An elder black man, dignified, unshaken, while those meant to embody order unraveled in chaos around him. One officer tried to slip back toward the doors, but the crowd surged forward, not touching, only recording, their silence heavier than any barricade. A voice called out, "Don't walk away now." We all saw it. The senior officer's hands curled into fists. For a moment, his pride demanded he fight back, but the reality pressed too hard. The live streams, the chants, the undeniable truth carved into the digital record forever. He looked smaller now, his broad frame hunched under the weight of exposure. Harold didn't look at them again. He didn't need to. His silence judged louder than any gavel. The plaza was alive with vindication. A teenager shouted, "This is history!" Another voice screamed, "You can't erase this! It's everywhere!" In less than 10 minutes, the balance of power had flipped. Officers who once towered now trembled. A crowd once silent now roared. And at the center, Harold stood composed, letting the chaos around him confirm the truth. Their crisis was his vindication. The roar of the crowd had reached its peak, a storm of chants and shouts rolling down the courthouse steps. Phones hovered like lanterns in the night, recording every second, unwilling to let the moment slip away. The officers stood frozen in the eye of it, uniforms wrinkled under the weight of panic, eyes darting like trapped animals. Harold finally moved. He lifted his phone again, the same one he had used moments earlier. His thumb pressed once, and a voice answered instantly, amplified by the speaker for all to hear. "Judge Whitmore, we're ready. How do you want to proceed?" The plaza hushed, just enough for every word to cut clear. The officers stiffened, realization dawning too late that they were not in control. Harold's voice was calm, each syllable striking like a gavel. "Suspend their access. Effective immediately." The crowd erupted gasps, cheers, disbelief colliding at once. The voice on the line confirmed. Crisp and merciless. "Understood. Credentials revoked. Incident logged and time-stamped." At that exact second, the officers' radios crackled, then died. Their earpieces flickered with static. The senior officer reached for his ID card, swiped it across the scanner by the door out of habit red light. Access denied. The younger officer tried his. Red. Another. Red. A chorus of buzzing denials filled the air, the sound of authority collapsing. The crowd howled in response. Someone shouted, "They just got locked out." Another yelled, "He fired them on the spot." Phones shook as cheers and laughter rolled across the steps. The senior officer's face drained of its last shred of color. He looked down at his badge as if it had betrayed him, then up at Harold, who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lifted a hand, yet had dismantled them in seconds. Harold lowered the phone, his tone still quiet, still absolute. "You wanted me outside. Now you'll stay outside. This court no longer recognizes your authority." The line between judgment and punishment vanished. It was happening in real time, in the open, with the world watching. The officers faltered, some taking small steps back, their boots scuffing against the marble. The crowd jeered, voices sharp as knives. "Justice served. How does it feel?" "You're finished." But Harold didn't bask in it. He wasn't there to humiliate. He was there to correct. His gaze swept once more across the men in uniform, steady and final. "Power without justice is nothing. Today you've learned that." The words landed heavy, carved into memory. Not shouted, not pleaded, delivered like truth itself. The senior officer lowered his head. For the first time, he had no command left to give. And in that silence, Judge Harold Whitmore turned, briefcase in hand, and walked toward the bronze doors. Each step sounded like a verdict. Each clap from the crowd, like approval of the sentence already carried out. The punishment was not in his anger. It was in their erasure, swift, public, and absolute. The bronze doors loomed ahead, massive and unmoving, symbols of power that had stood for more than a century. And now, with each step Harold took, they no longer belonged to the institution alone, they belonged to him. The crowd parted naturally, forming a corridor of raised phones and steady applause. Chants softened into awestruck silence. The storm had passed. What remained was clarity. Behind him, the officers stood broken, their radios dead, their badges meaningless, their voices swallowed by shame. No command, no barked order could rescue them from what the world had already witnessed. They weren't gatekeepers anymore. They were the example. Harold stopped at the top of the steps. For the first time, he turned back to the crowd. His eyes swept across them, students, workers, parents, tourists, strangers who had come together in an instant of shared outrage and had transformed it into something greater. Witness. His voice carried steady, deep, final. Justice doesn't begin inside these walls. It begins when dignity is defended outside them. The words landed heavy, then rolled through the plaza like a wave. Phones shook as people captured it, hashtags already forming in real time. A woman near the front whispered, "That's the quote. That's the line." Harold's gaze hardened, his tone dropping sharper, more personal. "I don't need to shout for the truth to be heard, and I don't need to fight for respect. It was mine before you tried to take it." The crowd erupted again, cheers, applause, even tears streaming down faces that had expected only another scene of humiliation, but instead had witnessed vindication. He lifted the briefcase slightly, almost like a gavel raised above the bench. "You thought silence was submission. It wasn't. It was judgment waiting to fall." The words cut deep, final, viral, ready. Phones caught the moment from every angle, voices already echoing online. Judgment waiting to fall. Then, without another glance at the men who had tried to erase him, Harold turned, pushed the bronze doors open, and stepped inside. The crowd stood for a moment in reverent quiet, then erupted one last time. A chant thundered, not just for Harold, but for what he represented. Dignity, justice, dignity, justice! The officers stayed outside, pale and powerless, while Harold disappeared into the halls of the very court they had tried to bar him from. The final image was clear: an elder black man, briefcase in hand, walking not as a victim, not as a suspect, but as the embodiment of law itself. No fanfare, no shouting, just truth, carried in silence until the exact moment it needed to be spoken. And as the crowd's voices carried his words into the world, one truth crystallized for everyone watching, on those steps and on millions of screens. Justice doesn't need noise. It only needs courage.